Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker, and today I have a special treat for you guys. A guest, for once, actually reached out to me to come on the show here. Dr. Linda Siegel. Welcome to the show, Linda.
Thank you. And it's Seger. Just think of Bob Seger, Seger.
Oh,
So
God, sorry about that.
that's all right.
Perfect. So yeah, as I said, welcome to the show. So for the audience, I did a show previously on religion and politics, and my show is primarily looking at the religious angle kind of thing. But when I did the politics, I wanted to approach it through the lens of how should a Christian look at these issues and that sort of thing. And the show I did with Dr. Tony Costa and Teddi Pappas were kind of from the conservative end or the Republican end. Linda's coming from the other side. Let's hear what the other side has to say on the Democratic side. So yeah, Linda, just before we get into the actual topic today, I just want to throw it to you to give us sort of an introduction as to who you are. Give us a notion of your faith journey, how you came to faith in Christ, and take the time to plug any projects or books or anything you'd like as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Dale. So I grew up Lutheran from a long line of Lutheran theologians and ministers and missionaries. And my mother was the church organist. She was the choir director. So I grew up in a church, so I didn't come to Christ later in life. I simply, from the time I was a babe, I was there sitting in church every Sunday. When I was in high school, I started getting interested in different denominations. I came from a family that was very open. So if I said, I'd like to go to a Methodist church this morning to see what that is like, instead of saying, oh, horrors, my mother would say, fine, here's the car keys. Just let me know when I'll be back at noon. And so I explored a lot of different denominations. And then in college, I realized I had inherited my religion. So I'm so many of us feel that way. You grew up Lutheran and you think, is this where I want to stay? So in college, I did another search and I got into fundamentalism, involved with the Navigators, and accepted Christ as my personal savior, and really did a lot of looking first at, do I want to stay a Christian, and then where do I want to fit, and how do I expand my Christianity. Then when I taught at a Southern Baptist college, Grand Canyon College, which is a huge college now in Phoenix, and began to want to do a little more searching. So I got baptized the second time, and then I decided to just look at a lot of churches I hadn't looked at before. I went to a Quaker meeting. There's very few of us Quakers in the world. I went to a Quaker meeting, sat down, I said, I'm home. This is my spiritual home. So I've been a Quaker since 1970, but I went to an interdenominational seminary for 5 years. I've sung with the Southern Baptist at Carnegie Hall. I've, the broad spread, I've had Catholic spiritual directors. So I'm actually very ecumenical in many different ways and know a lot about many different denominations as a result of this long search, and then saying I found what worked for me and what suited me in terms of an expression of my relationship with Christ.
Gotcha. Out of curiosity, did you, at any point during your searching, did you look outside of Christianity at all, at other religions?
Yes, at the very beginning, I decided when I was in college, I thought I'm going to be an agnostic for 6 months and I'm going to look at the religions of the world. And I did. And then it was fairly soon that I said, I want to stay a Christian. One of the reasons I wanted to stay a Christian is that Jesus is so involved in the world, in society. He's I have nothing against meditation or the monk on the hilltop or even the Buddhist beneath the tree. But for me, I just began to feel I wanted something that showed me how to be involved in the world and in society. And I felt I found that by coming back to Christianity. And the fundamentalists really helped me get back into the Bible, get back into the idea of a personal relationship, into prayer, these kinds of things. So I really value every stage of my search. And I think what's different from me than many people start their search because they're very unhappy with where they are. I was different. I really have huge respect for Lutherans, but I felt that for my personality, something that was less liturgical fit me better. I am, if you take the whole introvert extrovert, I'm way over on the extrovert side. And Lutheranism has beautiful music and lots of talking and lots of prayers and all of this. And I said, I need something a little quieter to balance my kind of personality. And I found that with the Quakers.
Interesting. All right, cool. Yeah, so I think getting into the actual, and I should just mention, just for myself, it's interesting that you had that 6 month period of being an agnostic. I actually lasted 6 months as well as an agnostic there, and then so yeah, there we go. Great minds think alike, I guess.
Yes.
All right, so let's get straight into the actual topic for today there. And I think the first thing to do, so you've written the latest version of your new book, Jesus Rode a Donkey, Why Millions of Christians Are Democrats. So the first thing to get straight, I think, is let's do some definitional work. In the first place, what do you mean? What is a Christian? We have many people claiming to be a Christian, but what do you think is
Yeah.
essential to that?
Well, probably the kind of core principle is that we recognize Jesus Christ as our personal Savior. We recognize Jesus Christ as the Son of God, as opposed to he was a good man. Now, the thing is, I don't like to have too tight definitions because I know people who identify as Christians who say he is our model. And they might actually not say he's the Son of God. Technically, I think a Christian usually says, you say the Son of God, but I am willing to always, if somebody said I identify as Christian, I don't do a long grill and put them to court and ask them lots of questions. But for me, I think that Son of God, and that he died and he was resurrected, and that his Spirit, the Holy Spirit, permeates everything. So I don't see the Christ Spirit, as he says, he gives us the Holy Spirit. I don't see that as having stopping places in our world or in our universe. I don't see any stopping places. And so that image I just love of that of Christ permeating even what I look out at. I'm in the mountains of Colorado. It doesn't mean I'm a pantheist, but I really believe that there is that spirit within all of life and just within all beauty. I believe in the creator God.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, I think just to sort of give my perspective, so we do have a lot in common. So Gary Habermas is a friend of mine, and he goes through the formula, sort of like the deity, death, and resurrection are key essentials. But yeah, I just want to get sort of your feedback. The way I understand trying to figure out what the essentials are is I look at what the Bible explicitly says is required. So that would be the death and resurrection, and also anything that's implicit. So if it says obeying this or something, it is essential, and then by implication, it said they gave commands about lying or something like that. So that's sort of a formula, and I know that you don't go for that, but do you see any sort of validity in approaching evaluating the essentials through a biblical lens? Or
Oh yes, and I do that, and I pretty much approach most things by starting with what does the Bible say about that, and then going into other steps. So, well, okay, what does this mean? What is the real meaning of this word? What are the because I went to seminary for 5 years, so I'm a theologian, meaning I've studied a lot of Christian theology. So I want to say, what do other Christians say about this? What is my experience? If I pray about this, what comes up? I believe that we can be very much in touch with the Spirit. And I also think because there's such a breadth of who Christ is, who God is, there's in the Christianity, somebody counted them, there's 300 names for God. In Islam, there's 99, and a lot of these names are actually very similar. But I think sometimes what we do is we say, of all the names of God, what I really want is healer, or what I really want is God who helps me through my illness or my relational problems or whatever. But we keep expanding. I think part of our work as Christians, we keep expanding who God is and our understanding and allowing that to work through us. So I worked for many, many years on saying, I'm just not compassionate enough. So let me work on compassion. And that one was about a 20-year deal. I clearly am more compassionate than I was 20 years ago. I probably can be more so, and I keep working on that. But I think many of us say, I'm just not patient enough. Well, okay, let's, with the help of the Holy Spirit, let's see if we can move forward on that one.
Exactly. Yeah. I think I agree with that approach. It's got to be a both and. It can't be an either or. You've got to incorporate both elements, and love has to be, and compassion has to be behind that.
Yes.
Right. Cool. So let's flip it. Okay. So we understand what you mean by Christian now, but what is it? What does it mean to be a Democrat? Because obviously in 2020, with the election coming up, I have heard from Democrats, some Democrats, sort of saying that they feel the party has moved away from them and that sort of thing. They've stayed where they are, but the party's left them. That's sort of the tagline or whatever. But yeah, what do you feel that it means to be a Democrat? What are the core essential values of being
Yeah,
that?
well, what's funny is when you say that is the Republicans say the same thing. There's all these the anti-Trump Republicans, the Lincoln Project, the veterans against Trump. I mean, so we hear it on both sides. And if you did watch the Democratic convention, you probably saw there were a number of Republicans that are endorsing Joe Biden have moved over. So you sort of, sometimes I say it depends on your news source, is who says the other people are wrong or something. So let me kind of talk a little bit about just the Democratic Party, because the first edition of Jesus Rode a Donkey came out in 2006, and this is the 5th edition. So I've been looking at party platforms. I watch a lot of news, etc. So this is what I would say about that seems to be fairly consistent with the Democratic Party, the platform, the candidates. 3 words, if I had to get it down: equality, diversity, and respect. So equality means that Democrats will pretty much across the board, they want equality for Blacks, they want equality for women, they want equality for LGBTQ people, they want equality for Asians and Hispanics. This inequality that has existed at the basis of our society, we can say racism, sexism, ageism, you name it, right across the board. Equality is a big, big thing, and they have a fairly consistent policy on what would they do to have, whether laws or to, stand to say everybody matters. And a lot of people say, well, Black Lives Matter, and then they say, well, other lives matter too. And they say, well, yes, but Black lives matter just like all other lives matter, and there's a whole lot of lives that haven't mattered enough in our country, and so we move toward equality. Then equality would also mean all sorts of ways of trying to equalize the playing field. So, for instance, Black women make about 60 cents to the dollar of white men for the same job. So you say, that's not fair, that's not just, so let's try to equalize that. So equality is, you can go right across the board on that. The second, diversity, that Democrats think of themselves as an umbrella party. What that means is we really try to be very inclusive, and we value diversity. We get very nervous when people shut out people. Now, one of the interesting things about Democrats is Democrats actually have a pro-life section within the Democratic Party. The platform itself is pro-choice, but there's a group called Democrats for Life because Democrats don't like to kick anyone out. So there's about 1 million members of what's called Democrats for Life, and they work to help reduce abortion. So they, and we can go into that later. So diversity. Then the third one is respect. And respect means nobody should be less important than other people. And respect can mean respect for the environment. We really want to take responsibility for the environment. We are concerned about climate change. We are concerned about the environmental standards and policies that have been pulled back. Respect for other people's religious freedom. So, for instance, there's a lot of, say, Muslims, Jews, people of other religions, including other or none at all, will probably tend more to lean Democrats than Republicans, because there is this sense, look, you have the right to worship however you want or not at all if that's what you want, is that we respect wherever that that takes you. So I kind of can get this down to equality, diversity, and respect.
Awesome. Nice and simple for me. Three steps there.
Yes.
Okay, and just to sort of follow up on that, so how do you sort of link the two then? So seeing these three core democratic essentials or values, how does that relate to your Christian faith or to the Bible or something, and how might that compare to Republican values as you see it?
Yeah, well, I think I really see Jesus Christ and God embracing all. And there's that one verse in the Bible about prostitutes will get to heaven sooner than some of the established religious types who, stand up and kind of pound their chest and say, I am the greatest religious person. I think that there's, from a Christian viewpoint, is just everybody is a child of God. Everybody is important. Everyone needs to be respected. And in Christianity, when you look at the whole sweep of the Bible, meaning one of the things you look at theologically is how often is an idea repeated in the Bible, is if it's hammering away at you and say, here is something you have got to really, really get because we're going to tell you 3,000 times or something. So one of the ideas that comes across in the Bible is to care for the poor and the needy. They usually say the poor and the needy, the widows and the orphans. And if you just want to go to concordance and see how often that comes up, over and over again, the prophets, the Old Testament, the New Testament, Jesus, you name it, it comes up. And so from a Christian viewpoint, when I started doing a lot of research and moved from Republican to Democrat, one of the things I looked at was the sweep of this idea. What are we doing to help those who are marginalized, who are disadvantaged, who don't have privilege, who are the outcasts, the lepers of our world? Remember Jesus with the lepers. And so one of the things, I see is that If you read the Democratic Party platform, they will talk over and over again about the working class, those who suffer, those people who don't have the advantages, where we as a nation are trying to help um, equalize that playing field. And another thing that the Bible talks about in hundreds of verses, the Bible says a nation will be judged, not just individuals. A nation will be judged by how they do justice and show mercy. So a nation is to be compassionate, and a nation is to be just. And to me, just has a lot to do with equality and respect. So I see, when I say the values of democracy and the values of Christianity, I think actually come together very much. And when I talk about the equality, diversity, and respect, those to me are also Christian values.
Gotcha. And okay, and in where do you sort of see the Republicans in relation to these values as well? Just in sort of a quick compare and contrast there.
Yeah. Well, the first thing, this year is a very unusual year for Republicans. There is no party platform this year. The party platform is a one-page document that says we are going to use the 2016 party platform, and basically we support Trump. That's basically the party platform. But another thing is, if you listen to the focus, let's say, of Republicans and Democrats, and you just say, I'm going to go back and forth between my two channels, or I'm going to listen to Biden and I'm going to listen to Trump, and to see what's emphasized, that the Republicans talk a lot about the economy, and they talk a lot about the stock market. Now, many people are not part of the stock market. The Democrats are more apt to talk about how do we help the people who are workers, the middle class, the people that have been ready to be evicted. Somebody that works with us is ready to be evicted, and she says, it's just a waiting game, because we're not getting any help. So Democrats will talk a lot about health, the Affordable Care Act. How do we make sure people with pre-existing conditions are taken care of? Get COVID once, get it a second time. If you don't have that pre-existing condition, you're in trouble. How do we protect Social Security and Medicare? And so there's a lot of talk from the Democrats about health. There's a lot more talk about the economy. And then I think you probably know that the tax cuts that were done under Trump really benefited the rich more than the others, and that the tax cuts that are usually recommended by the Democrats are going to really look a lot more toward the lower class and the middle class.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Cool. So yeah, I just wanted to get sort of your definitional thing, get sort of a lay of the land as to how the positions interrelate and that sort of thing. But I wanted to take us out with the next question to looking at religion and politics on a more abstract level. So, what do you see as sort of the interplay between religion in a democratic political sense? How do those
Yes.
sort of relate to each other, and how do Christians as individuals who also have a role to be political agents, right? In a democracy, we are a part of the state, technically speaking. So yeah, how does the interplay work there?
Well, I don't think Christ stops right before going into the ballot box. I think we take Christ into all aspects of what we do, so that I think our faith has the possibility of leading us to make policy decisions. So that means, who is the candidate we're going to vote for? What are the policies and the laws and the things that we really care about? And I think one place that here's my process. So the first thing I do is I start with scripture. What does the Bible say? Now, that doesn't take me all the way, because I can believe, for instance, The Bible has many, many verses about welcome the stranger. You are to treat the stranger or the immigrant in the way you treat your family. So if I start there with immigration, what's going to happen is I'm going to say, well, gee, all these people at our borders, can we handle them? What am I going to do? Oh, we should leave them out there. They don't really belong here. I can have all sorts of negative feelings toward the immigrant. When I read the Bible, I think I better get over that. That doesn't mean we open all our borders to everyone. It just means get over it, because if you start with the biblical standard of welcoming the stranger and love, then you might end up with quite a different policy. But that's the first steps. And I think that one of the things that in democracy and Christianity is that we have these stopping places. Just we grew up with them. For instance, I grew up in a white little town in northern Wisconsin. Didn't have anyone except whites there. So when I started going to college or met blacks, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to talk to a black. They were the other. They were that person who was different. Oh my gosh, we'd have nothing in common, etc. And so I started working on that because I felt the Bible and democracy told me this is not how I am to be as someone living in a democracy or someone who's a Christian. And I, through some period of time, by deliberately putting myself into situations where I would relate with blacks. And sometimes that meant joining church groups that were looking at racism. So, and I was doing that in the late 60s. And some people have stopping places about people who are gay and lesbian. They have no idea how to speak to them. So usually it's a good idea. Well, they are a child of God. And so get over it. Or transgender. And in 2016, I had a real stopping place about transgender people because I met several of them being involved with Democratic conventions and things like that. And I thought, you don't pull back, you move forward. And you keep saying, here's one of my favorite sayings: nothing human is foreign to me. So there is no other, there is only us. And if I'm putting up a barrier between me and somebody else, I need to look at that and try to get over it. And that might mean a lot of prayer and some other Bible reading, etc. So that was one of my things I learned in 2016 about, and because the opposite is nothing foreign is human to me. So we shut out the other, we shut out the person who is unlike ourselves and say, well, I just got to keep them out of our country, keep them out of the neighborhood, keep them out of, wherever we are. And one of the things I take very much from that is that Jesus expanded the idea of who our neighbor is. When we are to love our neighbor as ourselves, Jesus told the Good Samaritan story. And we say, oh yeah, you're supposed to go and help the person who's lying by the side of the road bleeding. But Jesus told the Good Samaritan story to Jews. Jews hated Samaritans. And so it's like saying, getting the Ku Klux Klan together and saying, I'm going to tell you a story about a model human being. There was a black man who, and you could just imagine. So we can take that neighbor and say, who is the neighbor we don't like? If you're a Republican, if you hate Democrats, oops, that's your neighbor. If you are a Christian and hate Muslims, oops, that's your neighbor. And so Jesus is asking us to do that, and democracy is asking us to allow equality, to keep working toward that more perfect union that embraces us and allows all of us to have a voice and to be important, to have the right to a working wage, to have the right to health care, to have the right to vote don't suppress anybody's vote. We are here to encourage, and we have to go so far as to say, me as a Democrat, I am to say to the Republican vote, I wish they'd vote for Biden, but if they don't, I'm still to say to that Republican, it is important to have your voice heard no matter what you vote for, but and think carefully, I mean, we all need to do some thinking, but we want to get past those walls. As the Pope says, we build bridges, not walls.
Gotcha. Yes, there's something that I really liked about what you said, and I agree 100% with, and I think all Christians should, is there should be an underlying motivation of love and seeing everyone. There is no us versus them. We're all human beings. We're all image bearers, created by God. So, we can perhaps differ on things like immigration policy. Maybe Republicans think this is the right policy, whereas Democrats think this is the right policy. And I'm totally ignorant of American immigration policies or something, so I can't speak competently to that. But we can work out the details. But the fundamental motivation behind it, seeing these people and wanting to do what's right for both them and us, is behind it to whatever degree that it makes sense to help them in that. So yeah, I think that's a good, important lesson. So yeah, we can have disagreements on the specifics, but that underlying motivation is always there. So
because we hope that what we do when we discuss policy, not rejecting each other. And one of the tests I think is an interesting test is, if you're a Republican, try to think of 5 Democrats you admire. And if you can't think of 5, it might be good to think harder. And it's a little test I do for myself at times, is to just say, okay, Linda, are there some people who are Republican besides my friends? I have a couple very, very dear friends who are Christian Republicans, quite far more conservative than I am. But when I'm talking about people like I personally really like John Kasich, I like Bill Kristol and George Will, who are conservatives, and I really like what they have to say. But anyway, make your list. If you can't think of 5 people from the other side of the aisle that you admire and respect, probably work a little harder and do a little prayer to get over it.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, since we're sort of touching upon it, I'll ask sort of question 3 here, which you kind of already answered. But just as a follow up with that, to what extent do you think that? So you gave us your sort of core values of the Democrats, and that's sort of a major contribution to your supporting them. I'm just wondering. So I'm sort of the opinion that I like to say I'm an independent. Some of my listeners told me, no, you more lean towards conservative. Okay, but I like to think I'm an independent, and I try to look at each election and the candidates themselves, and okay, what's the policy this time? I look at things afresh, rather, sometimes Democrat policies are the right fit for that time. Sometimes Republican policies are the right fit for that time and that sort of things. So I'm just wondering, for you, do you think it's better to have an overriding ideology that guides how you vote each time, or should you more want to, no, let's blank slate, okay, what's on offer this time, and how does that relate to what's important at this time?
Well, there is a thing where when you have a general value system, so for instance, let's just say besides I moved over to being a Democrat in the 1970s, but let's just say that I've done a whole lot of work about analyzing platforms and all that since 2006, and when the first edition of this book comes out. And that value systems tend to go kind of down a line, meaning, for instance, if my value system is equality, then I can take that value system and I can test it, and I can say, oh, consistently, the Democrats are going to emphasize that more than the Republicans. Well, oh, okay. So my value system, diversity. Oh, yes. Okay. So that doesn't mean that I would never vote for a Republican. It just means that generally my value system, and which is formed greatly by my Christian values, aligns better with the Democratic Party. But I can listen very much for the Republicans and say, yes, there are some things. Oh, I like that, or I like what you're saying. And so it isn't as if, well, I'm a Democrat, I'm going to buy into everything. It just says that generally the Democrat candidates and platforms are going to move down this path, and they are consistent. Equality and diversity are consistent with each other, and therefore I'm going to register Democrats, I'll work for the Democrats, I'll just say, yeah. However, on the other hand, let's just say if you were around some months ago when there were 20 candidates for the Democrats, there were some of those candidates I really did not care for. And I'm really glad they didn't make it too far down the line. And that whether or not I would have voted for them because of their policies, but I certainly was not going to embrace them. So that can be true in across the line. Just like when I watched all the Republican candidates last 4 years ago, there were a few that I did like. And there were some, I didn't, and then you get into policies. So it helps you. It's just like saying I'm a Christian, is to say I don't have to make my new decision every time. Everything in life, I don't have to go through my checklist for Buddhism and Hinduism and Muslim and then come back to, oh yes, is I know where I stand because those stands have come about through many years of thinking and pondering and praying and all the ways we make decisions. But like you say, when I was first, I was actually asked and assigned to write this book in 2006, and then I kept updating it. But they said, we want you to write a book called Jesus Was a Democrat. And I said, I can't write that book because I think Jesus was an independent. But I said, I think I know what you're getting at, is that you want a book that talks about the democratic Christian side of things and gives a voice to them, which is different than the books that take the other side. And I said, I can write that book if you can come up with a title that I feel comfortable with.
Gotcha. Yeah, I agree. It reminds me of Dale Allison's book on resurrecting Jesus. He kind of lays out the conservative Jesus and then the progressive or radical Jesus, he calls him, but
yes,
the progressive type Jesus. Yeah, so yeah, it's a both and picture there for sure. So okay, so a couple things that I would like to look in the abstract. I would also like to get your take. What are Christians to do when they feel like religious rights are in conflict with, the politics or political rights or something like that? How, and just in general, how should Christians go about deciding what they should do if they disagree with something the state's doing? Are there ever times they can disobey, or should they always obey, that sort of thing?
Well, the first question I think to always ask is whose religious rights? And I find many times Christians get all excited about their religious rights and forget that they are supposed to care about the rights of the Muslims and the Hindus and all the other, the Jews, etc. So I think the first place we start is to say everyone should have religious freedom rights. And we fought dearly for that. So as a Quaker, we had Quakers who died for religious freedom. In Massachusetts, Mary Dyer, there's a statue of her. And so we know this is the right to worship and to follow our leadings, however they might be, and whether someone else is in agreement with them. That is the right. And and we have the right also to resist anything that tries to take that right away from us. So, I mean, most Christians would say nonviolent resistance, but nevertheless. But I think in America, sometimes people feel persecuted, and they have the right to feel that way. I just sometimes think they feel persecuted individually, but they're not giving that same right to other people of different denominations or religions. So, so that's what religious freedom says. And it says the state is not supposed to tell me how to worship, and it's not to put me into any kind of a box, regardless, unless my ways of worshiping get in the way of somebody else's rights. So, I don't want people burning things in my neighborhood and or hurting other people and saying, well, it's my religious right as part of my religion to hurt other people. As to say, I don't think so.
I agree, by the way.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, there's got to be some kind of balance. So, like, again, I don't, because I'm a Canadian, so I'm based in Toronto, so I don't have
Yes.
in-depth knowledge apart from that. But in Canada, there are reasonable limits and that sort of thing enshrined in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So, things like common sense like that. One thing, so this is sort of a Canadian issue, but just to get your take on one thing that I fundamentally disagree with, and where I think the state, our province of Quebec, has imposed sort of a standard of saying, if you're an employee of the state or the province, you can't wear like a cross or wear
Oh,
religious.
yes.
I think that is them going too far. They can't do that. So
Yes. Yeah, yes. And some places have these same kind of things. Like if you're a Muslim, no, don't wear the headdress to work, and say, well, what does it hurt? So
yeah,
here's a question. As you probably know, I have probably seen the resume of a whole lot of education. So I have 3 master's degrees, plus my bachelor's plus a doctorate degree. So I've spent a lot of time studying things from a lot of different viewpoints. But I have a degree in what's called feminist theology, theology from the viewpoint of women. And one of the things we learned was to ask the question, who does it benefit and who does it harm? So with any policy, who gets to get all the goodies from the policy, and who's going to suffer as a result of that policy? And I think it's a good question to ask on any policies. Another question or concept that I think is very good is that the people that a policy affects should be at the table when that policy is discussed. So that means if someone is making a policy for the people who are poor, who have low income, before you presume what would be helpful for that person, is talk to that person. And, if you're making policies where you say, well, we're going to make a policy about Muslims, they say, well, it would be good to have some Muslims in the room. If you're making a policy that's going to affect conservatives, make sure some conservatives are in the room, that you are not projecting your own stereotypes or what you think is needed on that other person. And that's, it's sort of the thing of no taxation without representation. Well, no policy making without some representation, which is another reason why you really want a Congress that has a lot of diversity in it, so that different people can represent different points of view. And I think often we jump to conclusions about, well, this is what that person should do, and say, well, ask the person. And really look carefully at these policies to understand how they work, Who do they benefit? Who do they harm?
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I'm just debating whether to ask a quick follow up on something that I've sort of wondered about is the identity politics issue. So I might disagree with you, but I want to hear your reasoning. Why is it necessary to have a diverse members of Congress? Like, isn't it possible? Let's pretend it's all black. I still think that they can represent whites by consulting whites and making an informed decision. Is it really necessary that we have to have like an equal representation in order to represent those communities? Or yeah, why or why not?
Well, representation means, I mean, in a way, it does mean representation. So if you say, I come from a state which is 50% black, I'm not sure at any state is quite 50%, but let's just say I come from a state that has a greater black population, and I look at Congress and say there's not one black person there. We're not fairly represented. And that doesn't mean, so here's one way I look at it. If 50% of the population is women, and we're not nearly there in Congress, but it's something to say, I'd like to move in that direction. And one of the things somebody told me once is they said, until you have a healthy third, so let's say until Congress is a healthy third, the woman's voice is not as strong and clear. So it's not like going 50, you say, well, I'd like to have 50-50. I'd like to have Congress really represent what the population of, what the population of the United States is. Because we make presumptions and because we don't have the experience. So, for instance, I have had friends who were white, who were either married or living with people who were black, and they said it really gives you an insight about racism. It's like there in your pores. It just permeates everything. And she said, there's no way I can know that unless I'm in some way interrelating with what the situation is and the history, the context, etc. And so I think, well, this might be more of a Quaker concept anyway, but Quakers really value experience. And so being able to feel, empathy, I mean, that's what empathy is that you feel with what the other person is going through, but you also respect the other person. So when you say, well, maybe we should make this policy, and they say, wait a minute, this isn't what we need. Let me tell you what we need, because you wouldn't know this unless you had been in the inner city or unless you had, lived or are a person of color or something. So I think that respect of the other person's point of view and saying, I might be projecting my point of view onto them. I really want to hear their point of view. And we're probably never going to get it exact. It's not like saying, well, we only have 49% women. Are we failing miserably? Like, no. But I think we try to make sure those voices are heard.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So yeah, I think what you would say is that experiential knowledge that is unique is essential to creating good policy, and that's why you would say it needs to be that representation of the community. So okay.
Yes.
All right, cool. So that leads into the next topic, question 4, and I'm actually really excited to hear your take on this. So in one of the interviews I watched as part of my research on your website, you said something interesting. You said that you tend to observe that Christians who are Republican or evangelical Republicans tend to stress the individual rights component, and I'll confess I'm one of these guys that's sort of my focus as well. And Christians who are Democrats more have a communal or community-based focus and that sort of thing. So yeah, I just wanted to turn it to you. That's an interesting observation. Like, do you want to sort of explain what you mean about that?
Yes. So when I got into being a fundamentalist, I was an evangelical for a while, and there's a lot of focus on what you believe. So, an evangelical might say, are you a believer, or he's a believer, or he or she is a believer. And they'll use that word believer, meaning, what do you intellectually say? Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah.
And an evangelical will often say, have you accepted Christ as your personal savior? Which I have. And so you are looking a great deal at your relationship with God. What's my relationship. Now, in Catholicism, mysticism is much like that, where you say, well, have you seen visions, and have you heard audio messages from God? But that's part of mysticism. But mysticism is a lot about you quiet your mind, you get centered, you allow the Holy Spirit to be within you, you listen, so that's part of mysticism. Prayer, I mean, certainly, probably most of us Christians pray and to say, I really try to tune in and to center and not only do I ask God for things, but I try to listen to what God has to say. So all of this personal, you could say, what's going on in your heart. And that's I think that's very important. I think but then you have another group of people who work out their religion through society, through actions, through what they do. They heal the sick, they become doctors, they are missionaries, they are out there, into society. And some people say, well, my job is to heal the sick. Other people might say, my job is to understand why these people are sick, and is that something coming from society? Meaning, one of my teachers would always say, we have to do a social analysis. And, you knew that Susan was going to always say, social analysis time. What's going on in society? So that when we can say, I never want to hurt a Black person. I always want to be kind to them. I want to embrace. I hope I have some Black friends, etc. But the next step is, what is it in society that is causing this racism? Why is it that Blacks are getting COVID more than whites? Why is it that Blacks don't have many of the advantages, or don't make as much money? Why are they having more health issues? We can go on and on. And so you say there's something going on in our social structure that creates unfairness. And so there are many people who say, from a spiritual viewpoint, I have to look at what's going on out there, and to say, if I don't believe that Christ is stopped by anything, then I want to look at the world and say, God, I want you to have free reign in this world. I want goodness to happen. I want kindness to happen. I want things that make people more loving. I want to, again, to be fair, to be just, to be merciful. And so there's a point, you have to take your faith into the community, locally, and then you take your faith into the nation, and you take your faith into the world, and say, if I want to create a kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, what does that mean? Because I got to solve those problems on a social level, not just on an individual level. I cannot clean up the lakes and streams by myself, but I can vote for people who want to clean up the lakes and streams. And I can vote against people who are doing policies that are bad for the environment. This is God's creation. we have been asked to take responsibility and to do good in the world. And so I take that seriously. I'm voting for policies that recognize that our climate is being hurt and that the beauty of nature is being, in many ways, destroyed. And so I take my faith into the world.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think on mine, I agree with you. Even though I'm not perfect, as I said, I sort of lean more on the individualist thinker, and that's my fault. It's got to be both and.
Yeah.
So the way
Well,
oh, go ahead.
let me add one more thing, because this was a great insight for me from a class I took in seminary. That I took a class called The Nature of Religious Experience. And one of the things we talked a lot about in this class is that people religiously tend to fall into certain categories. And the teacher talked about the saint, the seer, and the sage. What that means is the saint is the person who, let's say Martin Luther King Jr., who takes his faith into the world and says, I'm going to try to do something about these injustices, and it is my faith that leads me there. So that's the person moving into society. Then the seer is the person who prays the monk on the hilltop, whatever. And then the sage is the person who maybe does theology. Like I probably fit a little more into that sage thing because I love to write about, let's put this together. Let's try to conceptualize that we can understand better. But, and so to some extent, so what you're saying is you move more toward that individual side, and yet you feel that sense, it's good to have also that social side. So one is we affirm who we are and what our calling is. The second thing, though, is the balance. And another theory is that if you are too much the person who is the intellectual, then you are not getting out and saying, oh, let me experience, let me help the poor, let me go, whatever that is to balance you, that your faith may not grow as much because you are not allowing those other aspects of faith to happen. So to some extent, we're always working on the inner, we're working on the outer, we're working on sometimes how to understand or we could say conceptualize. And I have put myself deliberately into situations, like I got involved with a charity in the Philippines, went there twice. They dealt with the poor. They also dealt with helping women get empowered. And I thought, I got to get out of my little shell. I have to expand. And so I'm not, when I say I'm not an activist in the way some people I know are activists, I have been in protest marches, not recently because of COVID, but I am not one that every time, I'm out there. That's not my calling, but I do get involved in those things because I think it balances me and my faith.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. I do think that's good advice. It reminds me of First John, right? You have to bear fruit.
And that, if I could follow up on that bearing fruit, because I think it's sort of part of this overall discussion. One of my favorite chapters in the Bible is Galatians 5. And that's the chapter where it describes what the fruits of the Holy Spirit are and how you know the Holy Spirit is not present. And I think we can take these ideas and we can look at candidates through that lens. We can look at policies through that lens. So the fruits of the Holy Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, goodness, self-control. So you can look at a candidate and say, am I seeing those qualities? Because those qualities need to keep expanding, not just in my individual self, but into the world. I want a more compassionate nation, and the Bible tells me we will be judged by whether our nation is compassionate. The proof of the Holy Spirit not being there are things like bragging, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, hatred, all those things that divide us and that make us hate each other. And the problem, the interesting thing about both of these things, like hatred is like an infection. And you get around it, you get infected. And it just spreads and spreads and spreads. But love does the same thing. That your better angels come to the forefront with love. Now, can I take a moment to mention a story, something that happened during this election cycle that was a real eye-opener for me. So I went to the Iowa caucus as an observer in February because I was finishing Jesus Rode a Donkey and I wanted that experiential side. You know, it's the first place that votes. And it was a good opportunity to go and hear some candidates speak. So as a Democrat, we have all these different candidates out there, and I liked most of them, and I was undecided. So I listened to several different candidates. And I had an experience with Joe Biden that was quite interesting and unexpected to me. So my friend and I got in line, and the first thing we noticed, people were talking to each other. We had been in other lines. In this line, there was this sense of camaraderie. And that's interesting. I mean, it's not so unusual, but it was just a sense of camaraderie and interest in each other. And okay. So I go into the building, and the first thing I know is this huge diversity. Now, Iowa's white. So, like, oh, there's Muslims, I see Hispanics, and I see diversity, also disabilities, you know, people in wheelchairs with canes and all that. The second thing I noticed is that not just the staffers, but everybody was helping each other. And I went up on the bleacher, and right away, like, people's hands are hold. It's not like I was stumbling. They just have their hands out to help me up the bleachers. I'm thinking that's kind of cool. And then I start noticing this care that's going among the group. And of course, Joe Biden is very empathetic. And he's had lots and lots of struggles where his faith has gotten him through and strengthened him and given him purpose. And so, I knew this. But something happened that really, really impressed me. In the middle of Biden's speech, there was a heckler, and someone yelled out something. And the crowd immediately went into this kind of titter of, oh, shut him up, where nobody said anything. You just knew, like, oh, don't talk. Joe Biden's supposed to be talking. Now, we know that's not unusual to happen. And when it's happened with Trump, is that he has said, punch him in the nose, and he says, get him out of here. And so there's been this immediate negative response to the other person, that bad person. Joe Biden stopped the crowd and he said, it's okay, he's okay. And the crowd just went like, oh, okay, we're not supposed to hate him. And it happened one other time, it was the same response. He's okay, it's okay. And when I walked out of that building, I turned to my friend and I said, Deb, my better angels have come to the forefront. It took away any of those feelings of, oh, shut up. And instead it says, oh, yeah, it's fine. And I said, I am a better person having walking out of this building than I was walking in. And I said, that's leadership. I really want my better angels to come to the forefront in any election and in any kind of political discussion. And we are so tempted to go into hate and fear. It's a temptation, it's always there. And I said, we've got to keep letting our better angels come to the forefront.
Gotcha. All right. All right. Thank you for sharing that person. I remember you mentioned that in one of your other interviews as well. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That made such a impact on you in terms of an
Yes.
experiential way. So okay. All right. So kind of focusing. I have three follow-up questions on this section then. So looking at individual rights versus communal rights. So I guess sort of the reason I sort of lean, just to explain my view quickly, you're the guest, so obviously your views are paramount. But I sort of see upholding individual rights as simultaneously benefiting the community. So long as we're systematic, consistent for everyone. And this is why they're so fundamentally important to me is, like we can establish these are the rights that we have, and if we uphold these universally, they benefit the community. We all know what we're allowed to do, what not to do. It also defines boundaries when I'm going above and beyond and reaching out and giving to charity or helping those poor people or something. It's not something that I'm required to do. I'm doing something good for you. So yeah, like this is sort of why I see it is so important to stress and clarify what the individual rights are, because it supplements and accentuates the communal rights and thinking communally. Does that make sense, or am I just talking?
Yes, no, I agree. And I think these individual rights, because we start with ourselves. What's our experience? Where do we feel tread upon? And where, at what point, though, am I truly tread upon? I think that's one question. Am I truly a victim here or not? But then secondly, if I am a victim, and if this is unfair and they are treading on my personal rights, like freedom of religion, etc., then yes, then it is time to respond in some way.
Gotcha. All right, perfect. And this one is going to be possibly a bit of a challenge, but first I want to clarify your view. So you said something interesting. Even here, you hinted at it, that the nation is judged communally for the sins of the community. So first of all, am I summarizing you accurately there?
Yeah, this was the big eye opener when I was really when I was researching Jesus Rode a Donkey. Just hundreds of verses in the Bible about the nation will be called to account by how they do justice and show mercy, and by how they help the poor and the needy. And I thought, boy, I don't know. I don't think we're doing real well. But isn't that something? As a nation, America will be judged by that, not just us as individuals.
Okay, so that's interesting then. So because approaching it from an individualist perspective, believe it or not, so we're not getting into homosexuality quite yet, but just using it as an illustration. I think that the Bible says it's a sin, it's wrong, but I can be progressive when it comes to civil rights, because I think, 1 Corinthians 5:2, Paul tells us, I'm not to judge those outside the church. They have the right to sin. In the same way, I don't think we should have a law against telling white lies, like, yes, my wife looks beautiful or something like that when she doesn't, or something. That it's not the state's role to impose Christian morality. But
Yes.
if what you're saying is true, that the nation is going to be judged based on the sins of individuals, what does that mean as a Christian? Should I be against? If I think the Bible is against these things, should I be voting according to that then? And go ahead.
Yeah, well, the first thing is these verses about the nation being judged, they're quite specific. They are, the nation is judged by whether they show justice, do and show mercy, whether they care for the poor and the needy, and the oppressed. So that's, it isn't like, well, if you had an abortion, the whole nation will be judged, or if people have abortions, the nation will be judged. That isn't what the Bible says. The Bible's very clear: justice and mercy. If you had to get it down to two words, you say justice and mercy. So I think that's where the judgment is. And they talk a lot about like kind of shoving the images are like shoving the poor into the ground and grinding away at them. In the Old Testament, Hebrew scriptures that we often know as the Old Testament, that there's a lot of places where the nation, the leader, is supposed to help the poor, like the gleaning of the fields, for the poor. That's in the book of Ruth, that said you're supposed to do that because the poor are not supposed to starve in a land of plenty. And there's the Jubilee year every 50 years. Things equalize the playing field again. I mean, there's a number of places where it says this is how the nation helps to do justice. So I think the abortion issue and the homosexuality issue are kind of a different kind of issue. I know we're going to get into those, and we can talk about those.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Yeah. Thank you very much. That actually did clarify things for me, because I was personally sort of confused as to how that made sense. So, all right. So it's only certain kinds of things that the nations are judged for. So, all right.
Well, according to the Bible, when you take out these verses and you look at them, that's what seems to be true over and over again, because that's the work of the nation. The nation does justice in a different, because I can't do justice for everyone. I am somewhat dependent on me voting for people who will create policies that will do justice.
All right, makes sense. So yeah, the last question in this section, and this is one. So I got some questions from one of our listeners who's a Republican side, but just in a general way, looking at communal finances or things like personal property. So one thing in the early church, they did share communal property. This is undeniable. It's in Acts and everything like that. So I'm wondering what's your sort of take on the notion of having personal property and accumulating wealth versus having the state sanction, using our taxes to help people. Like, what's sort of the interplay there?
Well, we do have a social responsibility, and I think if people have experienced being poor and perhaps even experience being rich, that when you are poor, there is such a struggle. I mean, when I was in seminary for 5 years, I turned over every nickel, and I was deep. There was one social program I was quite dependent on, was food stamps. I could not have made it. I worked 3 jobs. I still could not make it without food stamps, in terms of, and I had very low living expenses. And at one point, by mistake, my food stamps were stopped. And before they started again, I had to open my cupboard. There was only one thing in my cupboard. It was a box of cereal. So I had cereal and water waiting for my food stamps to come back. And so there is I think one thing we have to remember, those of us who do well. So let's just say I just turned 75. I just retired. I had a good career. It's hard to start, but 40 years in a career. And I'm not the wealthy class, but I guess I would be considered, let's just say I'd be considered upper middle class. Okay. I am in a totally different situation than the person who cleans our house who's ready to be evicted from her trailer. And I know what she's going through because I have been in a situation somewhat like that. And so there is a social responsibility to recognize that many of us who are doing well have had help. Nobody is a self-made person, even though they claim to be. We have help along the way. If I am white, I have certain privileges that maybe somebody who's Black wouldn't have. I might not have as many privileges a white man might have had in terms of getting my business going. So we have privileges, we have support systems, we have a lot of sort of help. And the concept of whether it's play it forward or give back, or to say, recognize those people are not necessarily poor because they choose to be poor and are stupid. They probably are not. Many of these people work 2 or 3 jobs like I did, and you still can't make it because, let's say, not a high enough minimum wage. So I don't think we get, I think there is always social responsibility, but that doesn't mean that I can't have nice things. So, that doesn't mean that, but I think that that you live in that place to say, I have to expand my idea of my faith. And I have to expand my idea that prosperity is not just for me, that I need to have some concern. So, I mean, one of the things we did was when we didn't have anyone come in the house for COVID, we still paid the person that came and cleaned for us. And we've, been concerned about her and say, if you need to move the trailer, we'll help out with that. So there is, and it's not, as they say, it's not a handout, it's a hand up. And that's a saying. I've certainly heard a number of Democratic candidates say that, is that we really recognize these disparate social problems. And I'm not saying they're all social, because there's people who make decisions that get them into bad places, but there's also people who grow up in families where the families are struggling, and you grow up and you say, well, I can't go to college I want to go to, we can't afford it. So I think we try to develop a consciousness, especially those who are what are called the white privileged, and I am a white privileged woman, that we try to keep our consciousness open to that other level of society, and saying, yes, I've been there, and there are many people there, and I used to just hate being so poor, and I now am so grateful for me having an experience of what people go through, and having the compassion of people who are ready to be evicted, don't know where the next rent is, can't, have to be in food lines for hours to have their trunk filled with some canned goods and some food that they can get through. I mean, just, that's real, and that's something we should have tremendous compassion for, of the suffering that is going around, and especially right now with COVID. So I'm not suffering much, but I just know how much so many people are suffering as a result of our situation right now.
I didn't I don't think I phrased her question totally perfectly. Like she says something like apparently Republican Christians are shown to give more money to charity than Democrats. And I think the fundamental basis behind this is that she's trying to say that their emphasis is the giving for these social programs should come from private individuals instead of being taken from the state and you. So what's the criteria? Oh, sorry.
Okay, here's the thing. And I'm totally, yes, charity, we give individually, but charity cannot handle all the problems that can only be solved in a more from a government. I don't know of any church saying we'll pay the rent for all the poor people in our church, and we'll also pay for their food and their education. That it just can't. So I think one thing is, yes, we give to charity, and that's an individual choice which charities that we give to. We also, again, We don't let our faith stop and say, well, it's just individual. We keep seeping it out into the society. So when you do something good in your local community, you're pushing it out beyond just maybe the money you give, but you also say, what are my values that can only be handled nationally? I can raise the minimum wage for my assistant, but I think the minimum wage should be raised for everyone, and I can't do that. But I can vote for people who say $15 an hour for a minimum wage will keep those people from having to work 3 jobs and then still not make it. Is that we can vote for that policy. I cannot clean up the lakes and streams, but I can vote for a candidate and for policies that will say, I care about the environment. I will take care of, maybe I'll take care of the pond down the road, but I want all the lakes and streams to be not to be polluted and not just mine that is next door. So I think it's that development of both kinds of consciousness. And I think what happens with this, I think the other thing that happens is say, well, I'll give to the charities I care about, is to say, well, but what about those people who are your neighbor? Meaning, are you helping the Muslim who is having problems? Is that you're probably helping the people within your church or maybe what the church can help with, but your help and your compassion can go much, much bigger, because if you're going to vote anyway, why not vote for the candidate who is going to do good in the world in places you can't reach?
Gotcha. Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So I think that gets to the heart of the question as that you answered there in terms of how do we go about deciding when it's right for the state to use taxpayer funds for certain social programs versus it's better to do it privately through charity or something. So
it's both. It's both.
Both. That's a common theme that we're learning. It's usually both and with a lot of time.
The love of Jesus for those of us in the world doesn't stop because it's only your neighborhood. It just keeps going bigger, 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 bigger. And I think that's something we have to learn to do, because it's hard to develop the global consciousness. It's because it's so abstract. Is to say, I'm supposed to care about the people in Afghanistan? Yes, you are. You don't have to spend your whole day caring about the people in Afghanistan, but there are no stopping places for the love of Christ.
So I'll move on to the next section, and this one is going to be very topical. What is the Christian's role in light of political action? So, are Christians supposed to go out protesting and perhaps even protest Christian views to get that in the political arena? Also, how would you like to do this? Would you want to answer these one at a time, or I've got the 3 things there? Or
why don't you say all 3, and then I might be able to pull them all together.
All right, cool. All right. Okay, so the other question is, how should Christians view, the violence, the rioting and looting that's going on, and people that use violence to get their political message?
Yeah, let's take that one first, because I think that's really important. There's been this tendency for people to glump everything together and say, oh, those awful protesters in the street. But we really do have to separate them, because there's 2 different groups. There are peaceful protesters, and peaceful protest has been part of our country from the beginning. That's how we gained a country. That there, before the Revolutionary War, people who became Americans said, England, you can't keep doing this to us, and it's not enough for us to sit in our little rooms and say, oh, too bad. We have to get out there as a group, and we have to stand up, and we have to resist tyrannical practices, whatever those might be. And that's why we have the United States of America, because we did that. The peaceful protest movement, so much of it has come out of the in America, has come out of the racism, and people like Martin Luther King Jr., who's more in the 60s, but it really goes back. But all over the world, many, many good things have happened as a result of peaceful protest. Even in the time right after Jesus, is that Caesar wanted everybody, I think even at that time, he wanted everybody to worship their idols. And the Jews said, no, we won't do that. And he says, well, I'll kill all of you. And he took about 1,000 of them or hundreds into the stadium, was going to kill them. And they just kind of like bowing your necks or something is, I don't think this is going to be a good idea. And he didn't, but there were peaceful protests even in Roman times and biblical times, but certainly throughout the history of the United States. That has been a fair way to do that. And nonviolent resistance changes people's minds and causes social change to happen because we come together communally. So 90% of what you've seen has been nonviolent, peaceful protest of people saying this is not right and it's gone on long enough and we really want social change, and we get it by communally coming together and making our voices heard. Now, the rioters and the looters, Joe Biden has been very clear. He says that is not the same thing as peaceful, nonviolent protests, and those people have to be held to account. And those people say, oh, those Democrats looting. Say, many of those people are not Democrats. They're Trump supporters. And if you looked at the videos in Portland, those were Trump supporters on the back of trucks shooting off paintballs and in some cases shooting guns. And so both sides, Democrats and Republicans, have these extremists who begin to destroy property and loot and burn. And I can't tell you whether it's 50-50 or who it's more of, but whatever it is that definitely Biden and I think Trump has come out against these, both of them have come out in one way or another against them. But Biden, it was very clear in his speech in Pittsburgh. He says, looting, violence, destruction of property, no, that is not, people need to be held account for what they do. And we need to be equal about it. So whether if the Democrat shot the Republican, the Democrat has to be held to account. But if the Republican shot the Democrat or whoever it was, both sides have to be held to account, because violence is not part of what we call nonviolent resistance.
Gotcha. Yep. Well said on that last bit. Whoever does it, we have law and order. If you're acting in a criminal way, whether you're Republican, Democrat, I don't care what you are, blue, purple, with pink polka dots, we need to be consistent there. But I do want to, I didn't hear in your answer, I do want to incorporate the Christian angle specifically here. So what about, so focusing on peaceful protests first, I take it you would say, yeah, this is a valid means for Christians to get their voice. It's proper for people that are anti-abortion or pro-life or pro-choice on either side to voice their opinions through peaceful protest. We would be universally against. Here's a question. So I think we both rightly in this context condemn people that are using rioting or violence for their political message, regardless of what side it is here. But you said that it is right in some circumstances. For example, the American revolutionaries and sorry. Oh, did I?
Yeah. We have to go to what part of the revolution? because the American Revolution started out with nonviolent protest, and then it eventually went into the violence. But the Boston Tea Party, for instance, now it's been discussed when we look at it from this viewpoint of peaceful, not, or maybe not. The Boston Tea Party is one of those things discussed because it was the destruction of property, but not the destruction of life. But before that, there was really nonviolent resistance, such as to the Stamp Acts, as we said, well, we're just going to stop using stamps. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of doing this. So one part of peaceful protest, which is really the purest part, is you simply let your voice be heard on behalf of those who are suffering. So I might go to a protest against what happened to George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, etc., because it isn't that it affected me personally, but in what sense it affects my nation, and it was wrong and it was unjust, and I want to stand with those, with others, to let the voice be heard. There is a place sometimes where people say, well, it's all right to destroy property, and I don't think it is. And I think that, and one might say, well, the rioters or looters, were they killing people? And say, no, but they were really destroying an awful lot, and that's not right, and that should be held to account. And then there is the other side where it ends up really is shooting people, and then you end up with civil war in one side or another. And I really would like to see the guns off the street. There is no place for guns in peaceful protest. And some of those guns have come in. Now you got to look at where those guns are coming from. I don't think any of those guns are the peaceful protesters that are carrying those guns. And many people will use these opportunities to foment violence and chaos and destruction who are not part of this movement. They probably couldn't care less about George Floyd. They just see it as a chance to create more chaos. And I think what we're always trying to do is to diffuse and get to be civil and respectful. And so you don't want to keep throwing fuel on the fire. And this is what I believe about leadership, is that leadership is trying to get us back to our better angels and to say, don't foment, but try to resolve and reconcile and work it out and listen and respect.
One last thing. So I'm sort of interested in, for the Christians specifically, when is it appropriate then? At what point were the American revolutionaries, just to keep it simple and not kind of go against modern application unless you want to, but at what point is it proper for a Christian to use violence? Because I remember having a discussion with Dr. Paul Copan, and he was just flat out saying, no, they were wrong to do that. You don't disobey the government unless they tell you to violate Christian moral precepts or something like that. And
well, there's a long. First of all, one of my huge heroes, of course, is Martin Luther King Jr. And it was his faith that pushed him into the call for justice. And if we say, yes, justice is a huge thing that the nation needs to be working toward, and if that means grassroots, whatever. Now, Quakers are pacifist. So what we believe is working for peace and not working for war. But one of the things in Jesus Rode a Donkey, I have a whole chapter on War and Peace, and it talks about what are the qualifications for what is called a just war. This is a just war theory that comes mainly out of the Catholics. And what are the qualifications for a just peace? And Quakers believe that we work for peace with the same fervency that people work for war, but that we try to look at the root causes. Why is this going on? So before we start saying, oh, awful, awful, what's going on out there, is to say, well, what's really awful is what started all this. That things begin with a simmer, they begin with a little flame, and then people don't notice, and the flame gets into a campfire, and then people still don't notice, and then it's burning a lot of stuff, and then somewhere along the line, people say, isn't that awful? And you say, well, what's really awful is this root cause that began all this and never got resolved. So let's go back to what the founder of Quakerism, George Fox, said, the occasion for war. What is the occasion? What is the situation that causes these problems that don't get resolved until they finally get huge? I mean, just look at what's going on in our country right now, between COVID, between the economy, between the racial tensions, between the hatred. You say, we got a real big problem in our nation right now that needs to be resolved, but it didn't start yesterday. It's been fomenting, but fuel has been put on this fire now for a period of time, and it is time for us to get back to the root causes of the fire, as well as trying to put out the fire.
Gotcha. Perfect. All right. So I'm going to move it on to the next question that I know you've been looking forward to. So it's specifically on gay rights and also the issue of abortion. These are, political hot topics or hot potatoes today, and a lot of times Christians will approach issues like these as sort of like a one issue voter. Oh, you're pro-choice Democrats, I'm against you, or you're pro gay rights, I'm against you, sort of thing. So, yeah, I just wanted to get your take. So, as a theologian, number one, do you feel that these Christians that think in this way, are they right, biblically speaking, that homosexuality and abortion are sinful? And number two, even if they are right, is it proper to treat these as though they're one issue deciders?
Mm. Well, these, to a certain extent, these are individual issues, meaning if we ask, who does it benefit and who does it harm? If I have a gay neighbor, I don't think I'm harmed very much. And in fact, I don't even think my neighborhood is harmed unless it's a not nice gay neighbor. If somebody down the road had an abortion, and let's just, I'm going to presume somebody down the road someplace had an abortion, it really isn't affecting my life in the society. It's so it isn't as much of a social problem. And I think this is where we have to separate. If the only issue you are voting for is whether or not your candidate is pro-choice or not, you are not thinking about the living. And that the living, you're not thinking about the climate, you're not thinking about the suffering of the poor, or the children in cages, or the immigrants that have walked 1,000 miles to escape certain death. You're not thinking about any of that. You're thinking about an individual decision about a person's body, or the individual decision about a person's who they love. And I'm not so convinced that these are really the major social problems for us to be thinking of. I think they are individual, ethical, I do think on the individual level, those are individual decisions and thoughts. So that's the first place I start with. The second place is on the issue of abortion. If we say we always start with scripture, go to theology, go to experience, and talk to people, etc. There is no verse in the Bible on abortion. There is none. Many Christians will say, well, the sanctity of life. And I say, well, if you believe in the sanctity of life, then you need to believe in the sanctity of life as a consistent life ethic. And a consistent life ethic says, if I really believe sanctity of life, I'm going to be against war, I'm going to be against capital punishment, I'm going to really be concerned about the children in cages, I'm going to be concerned about public health. That issue, is a very expansive issue. But when I begin with the Bible and say Jesus never talked about it, and we know abortions were going on, it's not like the abortions can be traced back to about 1500 or 2000 or 3000 BC. I mean, Egyptians talked about it. So nothing in the Bible about it. There's only one verse in the Bible that I could find that had anything kind of to do with it, and it's Numbers 5:11, and it's that chapter, and it's a story about a man who brought his wife in and accused to the priest and accused her of adultery. Now, there's nothing that says why he thought that. But what we do know is that women in biblical times, many of them were pregnant a lot. So it's very possible if you say, what if she were pregnant and he first felt it was not his child? So the priest gives bitter herbs to her, and he says, well, if the herbs don't have any effect on her at all, then she's innocent. If the herbs shrivel up her womb, which would be like an abortion, and she would never have children again, she'd be barren, then I guess that's proof of something. But whatever it is, it says, that's how you would induce an abortion in biblical times, is with various herbs that are going to have an effect. So you say, oh, well, that's an interesting verse. But if I had to make a political decision on abortion, I wouldn't make it based on that verse, and I wouldn't make it based on sanctity of life unless I could truly follow sanctity of life all the way through. But here's another thing. This group within the Democrats for Life, is that the difference between them and the Republicans is that the Democrats for Life say, how do we reduce abortions? We're not going to get them down to zero. In fact, if you create laws that do not allow abortions, there will actually be more abortions. And this comes from the research of countries that have done that, and they will be illegal abortions, and they will have a lot of more deaths as a result. So the Democrats say we want abortions to be safe, legal, and they sometimes add rare. But the Democrats for Life says we have to try to reduce abortions. We should have better family planning, better contraceptives, better education. We should really be working toward that. And here's an interesting statistic. There are fewer abortions under pro-choice administrations than otherwise. So why would that be? It's because there is more work being done to reduce abortions. And if that's what we want, people will say, I could never vote Democrat. You say, well, maybe you can. Maybe that will help you get there, and that will also help address it. On the homosexual issue, there's fewer than 10 verses, and most of them, when you go back to what the original words are, they're not so much talking about a homosexual act or about homosexual identity. They are talking more about abusive sexual relationships, such as a rich man taking advantage of a young boy, or a younger man taking advantage of a wealthy older man. And so if you look at all of them and just take them apart, put them in context, they're not exactly against homosexuality. They're against abusive relationships. There is only one that is clearly against homosexuality, and that is in the Mosaic codes, which are 3,000 years old, in the Old Testament, and we don't follow very many of them anymore. You don't carry wood on the Sabbath, women don't have short hair, women don't wear men's clothes like slacks, etc. And they were set up partly because the Israelites were moving into a new land and it was very important to populate. So you didn't want anyone that wasn't populating. So that's the first thing. Then you can look at the David and Jonathan story of these two men who deeply cared about each other. Conservatives say that was a friendship, and you say, yes, probably was. But they do say they kissed each other on the lips. They made a covenant with each other. They loved each other more than they loved someone of the opposite sex. That's what it says in the Bible. And when I really analyzed those verses, I said, I really don't know what David and Jonathan were doing. But, I really don't care very much, because just like I don't care about peering into my neighbor's windows to see what those two guys are doing. I don't care. That to me is an individual thing. And that it is that when I vote, I want to think about how do I create a better society, a more fair and just society. And I don't, the gays that I know are not hurting society at all. In fact, they're really helping it. And I admire and respect them greatly. And I don't want to get in the middle of what's going on in their private lives. That to me is individual.
Gotcha. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to give you a choice here, Linda, because I know you agreed to do 2 hours with me, and we're about 6 minutes away from that. So, all right, it's up to you. I did have some follow-ups on the abortion and homosexuality, but if you are pressed for time, I'm not going to force you to go longer. I'll just ask the last question, and we can end it.
No, we can follow up, and if you decide you want to go a few minutes after 11, I'm fine. I'm on Mountain Time, but we're fine. And I think those are two really important, because if a lot of your listeners are Republican Christians, those two, those are their core, really difficult issues. And so it might be important to just go forward with those.
Awesome. All right, cool. And I agree with that as well. So, all right. So taking the abortion issue first, because believe it or not, on this, I am a hardcore conservative. This is it's not a I don't believe in one issue votes, but this is something that's really important to me and to other authors. So the way I try to approach it is through the three sources of moral disagreement as I see it. So, sort of a philosophical approach. So, number one, people can disagree on whether abortion is right or wrong because they disagree on the facts. What does Scripture say it's wrong or not, or is that a human life in the womb or not? There's also disagreement on the moral principles. So that sort of speaks to the sanctity of life. I would call it more of a principle of life preservation. And then there's differences on the moral hierarchy, where two or more moral principles may conflict, and you have to choose what's the lesser of two evils or something. The woman's autonomy versus preserving the life. So in the first place, where do you think that where? So I'm hardcore that abortion is wrong. It's immoral to do. Apart from the political issues, do you see it as being immoral in any way?
Well, let me answer that by mentioning the name of the chapter on abortion in Jesus Wrote Donkey. It's called The Ethical Dilemma of Abortion. Ethics deals with the gray areas where you say, it doesn't matter what choice I make. It's just not the perfect choice. I'm caught between wanting to preserve all life. Let's just say wanting to preserve life and the woman's autonomy and all the difficulties that can happen where the woman who's poor and said, I just can't have another child. So the ethical dilemma has to do with who makes this choice. So in the best of all worlds, all children would be wanted. So the problem is not abortion. The problem is unwanted pregnancies. And we should be working very hard to say we don't want anyone to be in that position where there is this really, really difficult choice to make. But if there is a difficult choice to make, who should be making that choice? So let me quickly tell a story just to illustrate this point. I had a friend whose name was Jane, who was married, wanted children, got pregnant, absolutely ecstatic. Great. Went to the doctor. The doctor said, there is something wrong with this fetus. We're doing some tests. And he says, but the fetus will not survive. And we recommend an abortion now. Early stages, we know this. We know what this problem is. Because it is very dangerous, because this fetus is going to die in your womb, and it will be very dangerous for your health to have that happen. Now, Jane did not believe. She was pro-life. She says, no, no abortion. So she did what a reasonable person many times would do. You talk to your doctor, you talk to your minister, you talk to your parents, you talk to your friends, whatever. So Jane, one of the people Jane, of course, talked to was her mother, who would always have said, I'm pro-life. And you know what her mother said? Her mother said, a perfect pro-choice statement, Jane, whatever you decide, we will support, because this is a very difficult situation. She talked to me. I gave her the pro-choice statement. Jane, whatever you decide is fine, but here's what you need to be thinking about. If you are going to carry this through and put you, possibly your life in danger, make sure your doctor is on your side, and make sure you're really, really in touch. Otherwise, change doctors. Because if your doctor doesn't agree with your decision, doesn't support it, you need a doctor who will be there for you. And my husband talked to her. He's in the medical profession. And he said, this is very, very dangerous. What can happen? It's very dangerous to have dead matter in your body. So, but Jane, she prayed. She and her husband talked about it. They decided to go ahead and hope for a miracle. Well, the fetus did die in the womb. She did end up in the emergency room, and she was in danger. Now, the question is, who was supposed to make that decision for Jane? And one of our congressmen, Tim Kaine, had a similar situation where he said, the one person I did not want in that room making that decision was Uncle Sam. This was a very difficult decision, and I wanted to consult with a number of people and then make it. Now, this is a horrible thought, but if Jane had died, the one thing that would give me comfort, it was Jane's decision. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Donald Trump's. It wasn't, some ministers. It was her decision together with her husband consulting. And that's where I stand, is these ethical problems need to recognize that this is really difficult. And that's why I am so much for trying to have better Planned Parenthood in order that this decision doesn't come up much, but when it does, that it is done in a reasonable way, recognizing there is no right decision in a situation like this. It's just right smack in the middle of what we call Christian ethics.
Yeah, I think in terms of this specific example, yeah, so that is an exception where I do think abortion, if the doctors are saying it's not going to live anyways, and that's going to pose a health risk to the mother. I mean, in that case, it's the case where you have the principle of life preservation versus the principle of, oh, you want to say something?
Yes, well, here's the thing though, is see, even, and then you say, well, but okay, I'll agree to that one. But now here's another one, and then here's another one. And I would have the same feeling, is to say, I should not be making that decision for Mary or Judy or Millie. just like you shouldn't be, and Trump shouldn't be, and Mitch McConnell. I don't even want Adam Schiff or Nancy Pelosi to make that decision. Because you start getting on all these fine lines and say, well, that's all right, but oh, wait, and no, that isn't all right. No, it's like, let's try to deal with better family planning, that we don't have unwanted pregnancies, because the problem is unwanted pregnancies. That's the problem. Nobody is for abortion. Nobody thinks abortion is just the greatest thing. Let's just,
Uh,
every and even the Democrats are saying we're not for late-term abortions. We want good health care that says, okay, that let's look at this and help you make a good decision, but let's keep, again, work back to the root cause of what's the real problem to resolve the real problem, not the effect of not solving the problem. And one of the problems Democrats have with Republicans about this, Republicans keep trying to deny contraceptives and take away family planning and women's health, like Planned Parenthood. And you say, not having contraceptives cause more pregnancies. So it doesn't seem very rational and smart when you redefine the problem and say, let's see what we can do, and let's really look at the data, because boy, the data, when you forbid abortions, the data is awful. And having more women die as a result of making this kind of a decision. And notice how many of the people who are the people making decisions in government, the guys.
yeah,
So
it's
again, yeah, hey, you guys, I don't want you making this decision. I don't mind you having a place in it, you are the fathers, etc. But it's really, there's got to be lots of representation from women and doctors and ministers, and but I just don't want that personal individual decision made. And it's sort of an inconsistent policy, because Republicans really talk a lot about individual rights and say, don't take away my guns, don't take away my, this or that. They're really into individual rights. But then when it comes to something so amazingly individual as your body and the person you love, I think they try to get in the middle of that too much and say, think more about the society and the nation. And just keep asking, does it harm you to have a next door neighbor who's a homosexual or had an abortion?
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So I'll let this be my last comment, because again, you're the guest. People don't care what I think, but just to sort of give one little pushback. So number one, I agree with you that it's got to be both. Again, our consistent theme of today, both and, right? You should support contraceptives. Like, first of all, if for Christians, they shouldn't be having sex outside of marriage. Outside of marriage, I'm assuming we agree on that.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is, remember, a lot of people in marriage get pregnant who have abortions. So this idea that somehow it's those wild women, I don't know where the guys are as part of this, but the wild women are, just getting abortions all over the place, and say, no, a lot of people in marriage.
Gotcha. Good. Excellent point. Yep. Fair point there. And it's both, right? The guys are doing it too. But there's non-Christians, and there needs to be social programs like contraception and stuff. Fully agree with you on that. But I'm still, I can't get on board with what you're saying about it's got to be the person's choice. I think the government does have the right to step in when it's something as important as life preservation. If that was a baby that's 1 year old, we would have no issue saying, well, it should be the mother's choice, like that baby's. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and the thing is, we can get so wrapped up in this, and it's an important issue. There is no doubt this issue needs to be thought of and discussed and pondered and all that. But let's think of the living. One of my issues this year is that this is not the year to do a one issue vote. There are people dying. There are 6 million cases of COVID that didn't have to be that way. There's all these people who have died. There's children in cages. There's all the suffering going on. I mean, definitely no problem at all putting abortion and some of these other more personal issues into the mix. But this year, it's just like I say, please don't make this your only issue. There are people dying and suffering out there that need you to have a smart vote, a really thoughtful vote this year on how to make this a better society and stop this suffering. Oh my gosh, we are in bad shape right now.
Yeah, yeah. All right, cool. And I'll let, as I promised, I'll let you have the last word on that. And I support that last word. You shouldn't just be one issue. There are people dying on other issues that are important, just as important as abortion. So I support you on that point. All right. Quickly on homosexuality, for the most part, when it comes to gay rights in a political sense, you'll be happy to hear that I'm on your side. As a Christian, I think it's wrong. It's sin, but I think lying is a sin too. And I don't think
Yes.
it's the state's business to get involved there. So yeah.
Well, I think it is the state's business to get involved with lying that leads to things socially, such as lying about. We've gone into a lot of wars and had a lot of deaths as a result of people lying. There's one thing, the individual lie, but the social lie that says the lying is causing us to go into directions that are based on lies and falsehoods, and that causes human suffering, it causes deaths, it causes just lots and lots of problems that affect us socially.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, things like fraud, where there's certain forms of lying that the state has to get involved. So, all right, cool. So yeah, really the only issue of contention between us is, well, what does the Bible say? That's really what it boils down to. And I guess just one quick pushback. So you mentioned that I think there are about 6 verses in total that actually speak to the issue of homosexuality, 3 in the Old Testament and 3 in the New.
Mhm.
Um, but
Yes.
I want to focus on one in particular. So it's Romans chapters 1, verses 24 to 28. And this sort of links it to the created order. So this would be sort of a comeback that you said it's just talking about certain types of abusive homosexual relationships and that. And Paul in Romans, a lot of Christians will point out, but no, he's linking it to the created design plan that man and women are
Mhm.
created for each other in lawful matrimony. So, yeah, I just want to give you the last word to sort of, what about that angle? Does that,
Well, it's interesting because neither Paul nor Jesus married. And so um, there's many Christians who say, well, the natural order, the good thing is a nuclear family with a loving husband and wife and lovely children who grow up to be really good adults. And you say, I'm all for that. But the reality is, there's many different ways to be in relationship, and the Bible recognizes many of these ways, such as celibacy or in community, and choosing to marry, not to marry, I mean, etc. So there's maybe a little more leeway than saying it's all about the nuclear family. And so I think one of the things it gets down to is the individual. Here it gets back to experience. When I talk to my gay friends, many of them will say, I have never been attracted to someone of the opposite sex. And they say, I don't know why that is, but it goes way back, and you think that's interesting. And many of them say we're in sort of a continuum. There are people who are bisexual. There are people who clearly, think James Bond, really, really heterosexual. And so there's sort of a whole biological thing about this, where you say, what is this all about? I don't have the answer to that, but I do believe in love. I really believe in, we move toward people, and I just can't get to the point as a Christian of judging somebody for who they love and who they care deeply about. And even if I have trouble as a Christian, as a person in a democratic society, I still come down to say, I want that person to have all the rights I have. And even if I'm not a Christian that says, oh, they shouldn't be doing this. I'm a Christian that says, I don't want to get in the way of wherever love is happening. But I also say, even if I did have that view, I would not want to take that view into society, because from the democratic principles, democracy goes back, equality, diversity, and respect for everyone. And I also believe in justice and mercy from the Christian viewpoint. And I said, so
Gotcha.
I'm not going to make a judge. I have so many other things I'd like to make judgments on, meanness and nastiness and lying and war and struggles and hatred. And there's so many other things that right now are so important for us to really look at. And I think, as my last word, I would really suggest your listeners go read Galatians 5, about how we know where the fruits of the Spirit are. How can we assess, and how we know where the fruits of the Spirit are not. And think about that in terms of candidates, but also think about it in terms of policies. What kind of things can we do as a nation to make this a better, kinder, more loving, more compassionate country?
Excellent. You answered the last section there about how we bridge this political divide. So, yeah, I'll just add then my little quote from Denzel Washington in Malcolm X, where before there was a such thing as a Democrat or a Republican, there were Christians. We were Christians, and I think that's a fundamental message to take away from this show. Both Linda and I had some agreements. We had some things we disagreed on, but we came together cordially and respected each other and got each other's views. So, yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on, and I hope you had a good time on your end.
Oh, I did, Dale. I totally enjoyed talking to you, and also blessings to you and blessings to your listeners.
Oh, thank you very much. All right, perfect. So yeah, I hope the audience enjoyed that. The next guest, so I'm starting school next week, so I'm going to be slowing down podcasting ones. But I do have Dr. Shabir Ali, my friend, Dr. Shabir Ali, as an Islamic apologist, coming on to speak about the evidences for Islam. So that'll be the next new episode for you guys. And otherwise, I'm posting up old SNS archive shows for everyone. So have a great week, everybody. All right, take care, Linda.
Okay, thank you so much.